As the 1800s turned into the 1900s, the Melungeons became the subject of rumor, fascination, and prejudice. They didn't look like anyone else in the Appalachian Mountains. Their copper-colored skin, dark hair, and angular European features defied every racial label. To their white neighbors, they were a riddle that demanded explanation, and in a segregated society, any mystery was viewed with suspicion. The Melungeons themselves offered several stories about their origins. Some families claimed descent from Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Carolina coast. Others whispered that their ancestors were Turkish or Moorish slaves who escaped from Spanish ships. A few even believed they were connected to the lost colony of Roanoke, survivors who fled inland and merged with native tribes. But to outsiders, these tales sounded like fantasy. White settlers and early scholars dismissed them as triracial isolates, a crude label suggesting a mix of runaway slaves, Native Americans, and poor whites hiding from the law. In the eyes of the powerful, they were neither heroic nor mysterious, they were simply unwanted. By the early 1900s, racial science, the so-called eugenics movement, turned its gaze on the Melungeons. Researchers from major universities came into the hills, measuring skulls, cataloging skin tones, and photographing families like specimens. Their reports were chilling. One 1926 study by Arthur Estabrook of the Carnegie Institution described Melungeons as a degenerate strain, prone to crime and feeble-mindedness. Those words didn't just stain paper, they ruined lives. Government officials used these racist classifications to strip away what little freedom Melungeon families still had. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 declared that anyone with even one drop of non-white blood was legally colored. Birth certificates were changed. Marriages were annulled. Children were expelled from white schools. The state's registrar, Walter Plecker, became obsessed with tracking down Melungeons. He kept secret lists of suspect surnames, sending investigators to mountain schools to examine children's fingernails, hair texture, even skull shapes. Families who had quietly passed as white for generations suddenly found their entire identities erased overnight. The Ramsey family of Wise County suffered one of the cruelest examples. They were respected business owners with children in college, until an anonymous letter accused them of being Melungeon. Plecker's office changed their racial status by decree. Their children were expelled from school. Contracts were cancelled. A daughter's engagement was broken off. The family fled to Ohio, changed their names, and never spoke of their ancestry again. That silence, that deep generational shame, spread through Melungeon families across Appalachia. Photographs were burned. Family Bibles disappeared. Even names were changed to hide the past. By the mid-20th century, an entire culture that had survived 200 years of isolation had nearly vanished under the weight of discrimination. But time has a way of revealing what fear tries to bury. Because the truth, their true story, was still written in their blood. And soon, modern genetics would begin to speak for the ancestors who no longer could. For more than 2 centuries, the Melungeons had lived under the shadow of rumor and prejudice. Their story was shaped by hearsay, not evidence. But in the early 2000s, that changed, when genetics entered the picture. In 2002, a researcher named Dr. Kevin Jones at the University of Virginia launched what would become known as the Melungeon DNA Project. He collected saliva samples and cheek swabs from more than 100 families, people whose ancestors had been called Melungeon for generations. What he found stunned the scientific community. The Y chromosome, passed down from father to son, revealed a genetic tapestry unlike anything seen in North America. About 30% of Melungeon men carried haplogroup R1b, a marker common in Western Europe, especially in the British Isles and Portugal. Another 25% carried haplogroup E, which originated in North and West Africa. Around 15% had haplogroup J, linked to the Middle East. And 10% showed haplogroup Q, the signature of Native American ancestry. The remaining 20% came from all over, India, Central Asia, the Mediterranean, fragments of migrations that spanned continents and centuries. It wasn't just a triracial mix. It was a living map of the ancient world. The mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to daughter, told an equally remarkable story. There were European haplogroups like H and U. African lineages L1 and L2. Native American lines A, B, C, and D. And even M and N, markers found in South Asia and the Middle East. Dr. Jones compared these findings to populations across the Americas. Not even famously mixed groups like Louisiana Creoles or Brazilian Pardos showed this kind of diversity. The Melungeons were in a category of their own, a crossroads of human migration, sealed by isolation in the Appalachian Mountains. But genetics alone couldn't explain how people from so many corners of the earth ended up here. That mystery demanded history, and detective work. Researchers like Paul Heinegg began scouring old colonial records, piecing together fragments of names, land deeds, and court cases. The documents told a story that aligned perfectly with the DNA. In the 1600s, before America's racial boundaries hardened, the early colonies were full of unexpected encounters. Portuguese and Spanish sailors deserted ships along the Virginia coast. Turkish and Arab galley slaves escaped captivity. Free Africans, European indentured servants, and native tribes lived and worked side by side. One record from 1640s Virginia mentions John Collins, described as a Turk, who married a Native American woman. Their descendants later intermarried with Portuguese settlers and free African craftsmen, families who would eventually migrate west into the mountains. By the 1700s, those descendants, the Collins, Gibson, Goins, and Mullins families, had built small communities in the Appalachian frontier. When racial laws tightened, they became outcasts. And so, they disappeared, into the ridges and hollows, where time would seal their secret for centuries. Later genetic studies added even more astonishing clues. Dr. Roberta Estes, one of America's leading genetic genealogists, found that many Melungeon lineages carried ancient North African and Middle Eastern DNA, not recent admixture, but markers dating back 300 to 400 years, perfectly matching the colonial era. Even more astonishing, Dr. Janet Kuhn discovered a rare mitochondrial mutation shared by only 3 known populations on Earth. Small villages in northern Portugal. Isolated tribes in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And the Melungeons of Appalachia. It was genetic proof that their ancestors had come from very specific corners of the Mediterranean, and somehow, through a chain of survival, carried those genes halfway across the world. A genetic time capsule, hidden in plain sight. Even after the world changed around them, the Melungeons carried their history quietly, hidden behind new names, altered records, and generations of silence. The discrimination they faced had forced them into what sociologists later called ethnic shifting, the ability to change identity depending on circumstance. A Melungeon man might call himself Portuguese when applying for a marriage license, Indian when avoiding the draft, and white when trying to vote. It wasn't deceit. It was survival. Census records reveal this dance of identity across decades. In 1830, a family might be listed as free-colored. 10 years later, mulatto. By 1850, Indian. And if they moved to a new county, they might suddenly appear as white. In the Jim Crow South, being classified as non-white meant losing nearly everything: land, education, safety, and dignity. In Tennessee, free people of color were taxed at triple the white rate. In Virginia, they needed special permits just to own a dog or a firearm. And in North Carolina, they couldn't testify against whites, a law that made justice almost impossible. Education was perhaps the cruelest blow. Melungeon children were barred from white schools and often unwelcome in black ones. Some communities built their own small classrooms, but with no funding, teachers, or books, illiteracy soared to 90% by 1900. Yet even under such pressure, the Melungeons didn't vanish, they adapted. Stories of resistance became folklore in the mountains. One of the most famous was Mahala Mullins, a Melungeon woman who weighed nearly 500 pounds. When sheriffs came to arrest her for selling moonshine, she simply sat in her doorway, blocking the entrance, and laughed. They couldn't move her, so they left. Mahala was never taken to jail. To her people, she became a symbol of immovable strength. But for every story like Mahala's, there were hundreds of quieter tragedies, families stripped of their rights, pushed off their land, or forced to hide who they were. During the Civil War, many Melungeons tried to stay neutral, hiding in mountain caves and tending secret gardens by night. Some joined the Union Army, believing victory might bring equality. One of them, Jordan Gibson, survived 14 battles in the 8th Tennessee Infantry, only to return home and discover he still couldn't vote because officials couldn't determine his race. After the war, Reconstruction brought a brief moment of hope. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised citizenship and voting rights. But as soon as federal troops withdrew, new barriers replaced the old ones: poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that locked Melungeons out of democracy once again. By the early 1900s, the rise of eugenics made their struggle even harder. They weren't seen as individuals anymore, but as data, measured, photographed, and categorized by men who thought they could define humanity with a ruler and a skull caliper. Still, the Melungeons endured. They adapted, blended, and in many cases, vanished into the broader fabric of America, becoming white, black, or Indian depending on where fate took them. But DNA, unlike memory, cannot be erased. When the 1990s arrived, and with it the age of home DNA testing, the descendants of those mountain families began to notice something strange. A Portuguese surname here. A North African haplogroup there. And features that didn't quite fit the family stories they'd grown up with. Why did grandmother have dark olive skin? Why did great-uncle look Middle Eastern? Why did old family tales insist, we're Portuguese, but not like other Portuguese? Those questions led thousands of people to rediscover what their ancestors had spent lifetimes hiding. The internet connected them through forums, genealogy groups, and the Melungeon Heritage Association, a digital reunion centuries in the making. Photos were shared. Stories resurfaced. And for the first time in living memory, people began to speak the word Melungeon not as an insult, but as a badge of survival. Today, the word Melungeon carries a very different meaning. It's no longer whispered behind closed doors or used as a slur. It's spoken with pride, as a reminder of survival, of endurance, of roots that refuse to die. Modern DNA testing has confirmed what oral history had always suggested. That the Melungeons are not a mystery, but a mirror. A reflection of the earliest blending of peoples on the American continent. When you look at their DNA, you see the story of humanity itself. European explorers who crossed oceans. African sailors and artisans who brought their skills and spirit. Native Americans whose blood anchored the land. And even traces of ancient North Africa and the Middle East, echoing migrations from the dawn of civilization. Their genes carry whispers of Portuguese fishermen, Moorish navigators, Ottoman traders. And the tribes who watched the first ships appear on the horizon. Every generation since has carried those echoes forward. In the curve of a cheekbone. The tone of a voice. The rhythm of a story told by firelight. The past still breathes. For centuries, outsiders called them mixed, as if that were something broken. But genetics reveals a deeper truth. They weren't mixed, they were connected. Connected to the Atlantic world, to Africa, to the Mediterranean, to the Americas. Woven into one of the most intricate human tapestries ever recorded in North America. Today, descendants gather each year in Vardy, Tennessee. At the foot of the mountains where their ancestors once hid. They come with DNA charts, family Bibles, and faded photographs. They share stories, trade genealogy records, and walk the same dusty paths their great-grandparents once traveled. They aren't just searching for names. They're reclaiming an identity. An identity that says, we belong. Not because of blood purity, but because of the courage it took to survive in a world that demanded purity. The Melungeon story is more than a local legend. It's a microcosm of human history, proof that boundaries blur, cultures mix, and bloodlines intertwine long before anyone writes them down. And in that truth lies a powerful message for all of us. Our DNA doesn't divide us. It connects us, across time, across oceans, across every line ever drawn to keep people apart. Because in the end, the story of the Melungeons isn't just about a hidden people in the Appalachian Hills. It's about all of us. We are, each of us, the sum of countless journeys. A living record of migration, survival, and adaptation written in the quiet language of our genes. So when we look into our DNA, we aren't just finding out where we come from. We're rediscovering the story of humanity itself. A story that never truly vanished. It was simply waiting to be found again. Please like and subscribe. Thanks watching.